Moral psychology is something of a term of art in Anglophone philosophy, and some people interpret it in slightly different ways. I think the thing that makes the most sense here is just to go through a statement of some of the views that I'm calling broadly views in moral psychology that I think are Nietzsche's views, and the book does have some exegetical aims. But the book also aims to defend these views, not simply as an interpretation of Nietzsche, but as actually the correct views on these various questions. And I'm very frank in the book that some of the arguments, and certainly the empirical psychological evidence I adduce, goes well beyond things that Nietzsche says. I'm happy, however, to talk about exegetical questions as well as questions about the philosophical merits of the views. So the starting point is that Nietzsche is what I call an anti-realist about value. That is, he denies that there are any mind-independent or attitude-independent or judgment-independent values, right? What value there is dependent upon the human mind. One of the things I argue in chapter 4 of the book is that he actually holds the same view about epistemic value, that is, judgments about what ought to be believed, what is warranted, and so on. And that presents some interesting and potentially self-referential paradoxical issues that we might talk about, but a main focus of the early chapters of the book is on Nietzsche's arguments for anti-realism about moral value. These arguments are variations on what I call best explanation arguments. Best explanation arguments are of the form: what is the best explanation of someone's judgment that an act is morally wrong? Does the best explanation need to make reference to the objective moral wrongness of the act? Or can we, in fact, explain the judgment without any reference to mind-independent objective moral values? And I think Nietzsche has a number of best explanation style arguments. He thinks that the best explanation of our moral judgments does not require any reference to the existence of objective moral values. This is because, and now this is related to a second important view that Nietzsche holds, Nietzsche is what is usually called in the tradition a sentimentalist about moral judgment. In the Anglophone tradition, we associate that very strongly with the Scottish philosopher David Hume. In the German tradition, the 18th century philosopher Herder has a version of a sentimentalist view. Nietzsche was much more likely to have been familiar with Herder's version than Hume's version. Sentimentalists say, look, what's going on when we make a moral judgment is we are having a certain kind of affective or emotional response to some feature of the world, right? So the best explanation for our moral judgments appeals to the affects or emotions that are aroused in response to certain features of the world. Crucially, I take it that Nietzsche thinks the basic affective responses we have are ones of inclination towards and aversion away from acts, states of affairs, things, and so on. And that these basic affects are fundamentally non-cognitive. That is, that they can be individuated by what it feels like to have that kind of affect or emotion. It's important that basic affects be non-cognitive, because if you were a sentimentalist and thought moral judgments involved emotional responses, but you thought emotions had cognitive content, that is, emotions actually detected real features of the world, right? Then you would end up with a somewhat different kind of view. You wouldn't necessarily end up with anti-realism about morality. But as I say, I don't think that's Nietzsche's view. Now, why do we have the affective or emotional responses that we have, according to Nietzsche? It is in virtue of psychological facts about the type of person that we are, right? And here Nietzsche has a very radical but quite important, for understanding Nietzsche, view about what persons are basically like. People are fundamentally what you might say are bundles of drives. The sex drive is obviously a familiar one, a drive for hunger. Importantly for Nietzsche, he thinks there's a fundamental drive towards cruelty, and there are many others that we might mention. Drives you can think of as something like standing dispositions to have certain kinds of affective or emotional responses to states of affairs. So the sex drive is a disposition to become aroused in response in the presence of a sexually attractive person. And we could say similar things for hunger drives and others. So we are bundles of drives. Drives operate at a non-conscious level, though they're affective components. The affect that is aroused is something that we are typically aware of, that we're aware of. But the drives themselves that make us up exist at a non-conscious level. Okay? And so our moral judgments are ultimately to be explained in terms of our particular drives. But a second important feature of Nietzsche's picture of the mind is that he thinks that our conscious mental experience, and more particularly what we might call, and here I follow Mattia Riccardi, another Nietzsche scholar whose book on Nietzsche's philosophical psychology will be out next year, and I commend to everyone's attention if they're interested in this topic. He calls it reflexive consciousness. The idea here is that conscious deliberation, which we think that we engage in, is largely epiphenomenal, right? That we think that the conscious deliberation we engage in explains why we do what we do, but it doesn't. What really explains it is all the stuff going on at the non-conscious level, that is the operation of the various drives. We can talk a bit more about why Nietzsche thinks conscious deliberation is so misleading as to what goes on in agency, but I won't try to review those arguments right now. Okay? So human beings are these bundles of drives. Conscious deliberation is largely an epiphenomenon, a kind of illusion. And unsurprisingly, an upshot of this is that Nietzsche denies that people have free will, and he denies that they have free will in either of the senses that have been common in modern philosophy. Compatibilists about free will claim that the will is free insofar as it is causally determined in the right kind of way. For example, if we identify with the desires on which we act, then our will is free. Incompatibilists about free will say for the will to be free, the will has to stand outside the causal order, right? It's got to be self-determining in some sense. Nietzsche has arguments against both kinds of possible ways in which the will could be free. You can see already how, given his view about conscious deliberation and the role that non-conscious drives play in the determination of action, why he might end up being quite skeptical that anybody has free will. If people lack free will, then it also turns out that they are never morally responsible. And indeed, it is one of Nietzsche's great ambitions to, as it were, purge from our way of thinking about ourselves all the allied notions of moral responsibility, guilt, blame, and so on. That's kind of a high-level overview of some of the main theses that are argued for in the book. As I say, a lot of it turns on details of philosophical arguments for moral anti-realism, argument against compatibilist views of free will. And I also spend a fair amount of time reviewing the empirical psychological literature, because one of the things that the recent empirical psychological literature, because one of the interesting things about Nietzsche is that he's a really good psychologist. He thought he was, and a lot of empirical psychology in the last 50 years has vindicated his views. So, for example, I think it's fair to say that it is a standard view of contemporary cognitive science that most of our conscious life is, if not entirely, largely epiphenomenal, right? And that our conscious self-perception of what we're doing and why we're doing it has very little to do with what we're doing and why we're doing it.
So the final chapter of my recent book, which is co-authored with Joshua Knobe, who's a philosopher, cognitive science guy at Yale, tries to go through different aspects of Nietzsche's moral psychology that seem to have won a lot of empirical support. Mm-hmm. Nietzsche's idea that there are psychological types, and indeed that the psychological type of person you are is a heritable characteristic. That is, it can be passed on. A lot of very good evidence for that, right? A lot of it coming out of famous studies done of twins that were separated at birth and raised separately, but turned out to be extremely similar of psychological type. Nietzsche's skepticism about the importance of consciousness has won a great deal of support across many different aspects of contemporary empirical psychology. Not every detail, but the general picture seems to be basically right, that we overestimate how much important consciousness is, that we significantly underestimate the amount of our mental activity that participates outside the domain of consciousness, and that is absolutely crucial in explaining the things that we do. So I think that's another very important set of claims that that find support in Nietzsche. I'm going to actually just look at my chapter to see if I've left out a particularly important one. Those are the two that immediately leap to mind. I think the role of the role of affects and emotions in moral judgment and moral action has been significantly vindicated by empirical psychological research. That moral judgments really do depend upon an emotional and affective response. That a purely rational moral motivation is very, very hard to come by, very rare. That when people act in ways that we ordinarily appraise as moral, it's largely because of certain affective or emotional responses that they have. So I think that's another aspect of his view that has aged well over time.